Hello, honeys, and welcome back to a new Beesness. I am going to start with a bit of a disclaimer here. I am dog sitting this week, so if you hear clicking nails, a growl or something, just know that it's all mostly under control. Todd and Puka are quite the pair, but you know what? I'm getting all the cuddles I needed, so win! This episode will be exploring some of the stories, some of the headlines that I thought were worth a closer look from October 13th through the 19th. And without any further ado, I'll remind you that there's the source doc, as always, linked in the episode description if you want it. Our first headline today is kind of a follow-up in that it's another unexpected and unprecedented, I believe, move from the Isabella Gardner Museum. This time, they've purchased a neighboring 5-floor apartment building for $22.8 million. Prior to the sale, that was the only non-museum property on the block adjacent to its new wing in Boston's Fenway Court. The residential building now makes the museum the landlord for the current tenants in an unusual yet so far problem-free situation. Now, what caught my attention about this story, honeys, is that the museum explicitly said the purchase was a move to safeguard the area from potential development, from any threats to the current state of the museum, its surrounding area, and the general experience of visitors. This is pretty fascinating because, as Hyperallergic says, quote, the deal seems to suggest that the museum views nearby commercial development, more specifically, as a serious threat, end quote. This protectionist sort of attitude in property buying is a really surprising thing for a public institution that's meant to serve the demographic of its surrounding area, regardless of what that demographic is. All in all, very unusual move for them and suggests that there might be further disagreements regarding zoning, especially commercial development zoning, in and around Fenway Park. Last week saw a number of headlines in the institutional and legal world besides the Gardner purchase. The least anticipated and possibly most shocking of which was that multiple women artists were among 200 Jewish activists arrested at a New York City protest for Palestine. The protests and arrests occurred on October 14th. The artists in question included Nan Golden, Molly Crabapple, and filmmaker Laura Poitras. Those three were arrested alongside 197 Jewish Voice for Peace members for participating in the sit-in outside of the New York Stock Exchange, technically on trespass charges. The group Jewish Voice for Peace, or JVP, has been vocal in their criticism of Western nations who've supplied Israel with weaponry. What was so amazing about this protest was in part the size. A total of 500 protesters showed up, and they included descendants of Holocaust survivors, local teachers, members of women's and non-binary choir, the Resistance Revival Chorus. But the protest itself was pretty impressive. The actions were timed to begin with the opening of the stock exchange trading floors at 9:30, when activists wearing Not in Our Name t-shirts covered Wall Street's famous Charging Bull and Fearless Girl statues with red garments, as well as unfurling banners reading things like, quote, Gaza bombed, Wall Street booms, end quote. Sources say that at least 6 activists also chained their bodies to the building's main entrance gates. Police officers forcibly removed them from the site, as evidenced in photo and video, but ultimately the protest crowd dispersed at about 12:30. So why Wall Street and why such sayings? Well, the protesters aim to criticize the rising stock prices of weapons manufacturers such as Lockheed Martin, as Hyperallergic says, quote, the biggest arms maker in the United States amid Israel's ongoing attacks against Gaza and Lebanon, end quote. Other reasons to pay attention to this story: the incredibly strategic timing of the protest. It coincided with the U.S. observance of Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as the weekend's observance of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. It also comes shortly after viral video footage from an Israeli airstrike that hit and ignited a Gaza hospital complex caused uproar on social media. As an art historian, I also am fascinated by the intentional historical reference here to the 1987 protest at the stock exchange by AIDS advocacy group ACT UP, who were aiming to pressure pharmaceutical companies to lower the prices for AIDS medication. In the words of artist and ACT UP activist Greg Bordowitz, quote, "Today, a growing anti-war movement returns to this street to demand health care, not warfare," end quote. And finally, that major name artists are also joining in the rising crowd calling for Israel to lay off. Says Crabapple, quote, "With their genocidal campaign, Israel is destroying the people and places I love with the help of the U.S. government. To protest is the very least I can do," end quote. We also saw that New York art advisor Lisa Schiff pled guilty in her $6.5 million fraud case. Schiff was accused of embezzling her clients out of millions in a multi-year scheme. This story begins with 2 lawsuits last May by clients of her consulting firm, Schiff Fine Art. The suits accused her of, quote, "diverting profits from the sale of artworks and payments they made to purchase artworks from galleries," end quote. Then in January of 2024, things got worse. Schiff filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy for around $7 million in debt owed by not only the firm, but also herself. Based on the documents from that bankruptcy filing, we know that she owed upwards of $1 million to the Internal Revenue Service, just over $400,000 to the New York State Tax Department, and more than $160,000 to the New York City Department of Finance. And then it got even worse. According to court documents filed last August, in addition to the 2 suits, approximately 40 other entities consisting of former friends, collectors, artists and estates, galleries, and brokerage firms filed similar claims against Schiff. So a summary of the case at this point. Schiff has pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud in a New York district court as of October 17th, says the U.S. Attorney's Office, defrauding her clients to use money for a luxurious personal life. She also admitted to defrauding these clients of approximately $6.5 million in total based on the purchase and sale of 55 artworks. With this admission, she's basically agreed to forfeit approximately $6.4 million and a sentence of up to 20 years in prison. The sentencing itself is scheduled for January 17th. We were also surprised to hear that the Texas Art Museum briefly closed its show about cowboys, race, and gender after visitor feedback. The exhibition in question was first mounted last September by the Museum of Contemporary Art of Denver. Per its own press packets, it's aiming to unpack the concept of the cowboy, expanding it to more accurate representations of historical truths about the ranges of race, gender, sexuality, and nationality within the cowboy community. The museum told the publication The Fort Worth Report, which was the first to break the news, that Cowboy opened as planned at the Amon Carter in late September, yet was closed by October 11th. It has since reopened with no changes made except for one addition, a, quote, mature content label. The museum now invites guests to preview the works on display via a QR code in the show before entry. So why we care? This warning label doesn't really say what works. It references or explains why it was ever needed, why the exhibition was closed. These artworks don't contain any nudity. There's no sexual touching of any kind. So this quote-unquote mature content warning seems to indicate a certain level of bigotry, maybe. That because the content is queer, it must only be for adult eyes. I think it's telling that the closure was all the more unexpected with the Denver show having such a positive reception. It's possible the museum is only trying to safeguard itself because of the location. The curator of the exhibition himself said that it is the right one for open-minded people. Any further developments on that, we'll keep you posted. We also heard last week that Iron Age swords, which were previously seized by customs, have turned out to be glued together fakes. The swords in question were believed to be classic examples of their kind with specific traits notable to that sort of sword. They were instead revealed as a collection of fakes via new scanning techniques. So why the real ones matter? According to Nathaniel Erbsatulo from the Cranfield University, they matter for technological records because they often contain both bronze as well as other metals. They give clues to the transition, therefore, between the two ages and the spread of fusing techniques across various regions. The scans that revealed this information were neutron tomography, a technique of scanning that can pick up different things than X-rays can. They were done by scientists at the ISIS-1 and Neutron Source in Oxfordshire. So why feature this story in the Beesness? Because, in the words of the own experts behind this discovery, quote, by highlighting this, we highlight not just how widespread this kind of thing is, but also that this is negatively impacting our understanding of this technological transition of global importance, the beginning of iron, end quote. Furthermore, these items had been intercepted at Heathrow on their way to the British Museum. The same experts believe it was likely one of many such fake collections, so there could be future scandals to come here. And this research adds another layer of complication and authenticity issues to an already touchy subject. Many such swords have come onto the market either illegally, especially from the 19th century, or via this method of piecing together. Moving on to some pretty shocking discoveries and announcements from this last week. First and foremost, the Taliban has banned images of living beings in some Afghan media. The Associated Press was the first to break the news, citing Saiful Islam Khyber, the spokesperson for the Afghanistan Ministry of the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, or the PVPV. Khyber announced that media in the provinces of Takhar, Maidan Wardak, and Kandahar are now not to publicize images of any beings, quote, with a soul, meaning people and animals, end quote. To do so would risk violating the regime's interpretation of Sharia law. They added that eventually this law will apply to all of Afghanistan, though it will be implemented in other regions more slowly. This law is one of many new sets of rules that have increased restrictions on daily life as well as press and speech freedoms in the nation since the Taliban seized control of the Afghan government in 2021. Human rights organizations are especially concerned over the escalating threats to individual freedoms, the repression of even state-run media outlets, and the rising cases of crimes against humanity coming out of the country. Reporters Without Borders ranked Afghanistan as the third worst country out of 180 for journalistic freedom in its 2024 World Press Freedom Index, in fact. As you may have guessed, honeys, this is at the core of why we care. On top of that, there was no further clarity given on what media will be affected by this rule and whether they will affect foreign outlets. The Vice and Virtue Ministry has not responded to hyperallergic requests for comment. Says Omaid Sharifi, co-founder of the grassroots Afghan street art collective Art Lords, quote, visual imagery is a powerful tool for communication in a country where literacy rates are still developing. By banning images of living beings, the Taliban is effectively silencing voices, erasing identities, and impeding the public's access to critical information, end quote. We'll continue to keep a close eye on this one for you, honeys. And in our possibly saddest story yet, bit of a trigger warning here because it involves death, we were very saddened to hear that the award-winning photojournalist Paul Lowe has been killed in a stabbing. The 60-year-old British photojournalist and educator was the victim of the crime, which took place in the San Gabriel Mountains outside of LA last weekend. Some of the most memorable events captured in Lowe's photos include the siege of Sarajevo during the collapse of the former Yugoslavia, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the release of South African anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela from prison. His works appeared in publications including Time, Life, Newsweek, and The Independent. The really sad part is that his 19-year-old son, Emir Abadzik Lowe, was detained as the suspect after being caught up in a traffic collision a few miles away shortly after the stabbing. Says Lowe's spouse, Amra Abadzik Lowe, in the New York Times, the couple was only trying to help their son, who'd been struggling with psychosis and other mental health issues the past year. But on October 15th, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office filed for one count of murder. And our final story for the evening, to try and bring things back up just a little bit, next year's Met Museum Gala will put the spotlight on Black menswear and dandyism. The spring costume exhibition will be titled Superfine, Tailoring Black Style, and it will trace the cultural trends of fine dress, mostly among dandy lines from the transatlantic slave trade origins when the style was forced upon Black men in Victorian England to its 20th century reclamation by Black and brown activist communities, all the way up to contemporary designer reimaginations. So why do we care? Well, this is the Met Gala's first menswear focus in a while, the first menswear show, in fact, since the 2003 Braveheart one. That gala explored the role of the skirt as a gender-specific clothing item and its historical use as a means to redefine masculine ideals. We also care because of the subject matter here, that it's specifically focusing on Black history and the culture of dandies. We love that there's this representation and creativity focus. Says Bernard professor and guest curator Monica L. Miller, quote, "Fashion and dress have been used in a contest of power and aesthetics for Black people from the time of enslavement to the present, and dandyism has long served as a vehicle through which one can manipulate the relationship between clothing, identity, and power," end quote. All right, honeys, that's all I've got for you this week. Hope you've enjoyed your headlines. Hope you're staying safe, hydrated, all that. I'm going to attempt to wrangle these hooligans back into line for their DINNER and wish me luck. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.